Okay, so we're delighted to welcome, virtually at least, Professor Gaute Eggertsen to be our keynote this year's conference. He represents the blend of theoretical rigor and policy relevance that the Qatar Center tries to promote. In his illustrious career, Gaute has progressed from his PhD at Princeton through a productive stint in New York at the Fed and various elite academic institutions to become a key voice, as we all know. So now Professor at Brown, having spent time at Columbia, Gaute is well known for homing in on key debates and attacking some of the most intractable problems, providing frameworks for policymakers in otherwise confusing situations where standard intuition might lead them astray. I'm thinking of his work on zero lower bound and the often counterintuitive phenomena that emerge in that environment, or in formalizing concepts of secular stagnation, for example, and there are many other examples. So with policy regimes scrutinized following the recent inflation, as we've heard today, Gaute's work and commentary on how effectively to pursue price stability are listened to by central bankers around the world. His blend of monetary and fiscal interaction is also especially timely. As such, it's hard to think of a more suited speaker for this conference and this audience. So Gaute, over to you. It's a delight to have you speak for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm very disappointed I couldn't be there in person. I'd already scheduled a grand tour of England and visiting my friend Andrea Ferrero in Oxford, but family circumstances just prevented me, unfortunately, last minute to come. So what I wanted to talk about today is a paper that has been in the brewing maybe for too long, because we wrote it some years ago, and my co-author is starting to get angry at me for us not having submitted this already. So what is this paper? It's called It's Back, and what we mean by back, it's a play on Paul Krugman's famous paper on the CLB from '98, one of my favorite papers. He was talking about the liquidity trap being back, but here we have another sort of old phenomena returning to the fore, which is the nonlinear Phillips curve, which has, throughout my life, been assumed to be linear in a format that I'll show you shortly. And we're going to use that to explain the surge in inflation in 2020s, and that's going to be the gist of this talk. So let me give you just the original motivation, and this is actually the real motivation. Yeah, by the way, this is joined with my good friend and all dating back to grad school, Piero Paolo Benigno, who is now in Bern. So let me get right to it. So the intuition here is of a humbling kind, because I was, like some others, like totally wrong on inflation. I suppose I was getting quite maybe overconfident, because I'd written on the zero lower bound in the early 2000s, and then, you know, what happened 2008 and afterwards seemed to sort of follow a script where I felt that I was having, you know, more or less a framework to think about it. And so with great level of confidence, I declared at a very unfortunate moment that in September 2021, that this surge in inflation, you recall it was sort of surging in the summer of 2021, that it was just a temporary blip. But what was even worse, so I have written only one op-ed in my career as economist, and I chose this moment to write my thoughts. And the only good thing I can say about that op-ed is that it was written in Japanese. So I'm hopeful that there are not many in the audience that can actually read it, but I can just summarize it for you. Basically, it says, inflation, not a problem, nothing to see here. And you can see that it was sort of starting to decline a little bit for a very, very brief moment in September, when sort of team temporary is the nomenclature that was used at the time, and I find it actually kind of galling that people that, like myself, were part of Team Temporary are trying to claim some sort of a victory now because inflation is dropping, what, now 3 years later, and it's not even clear. So this just led me to completely revise my, or I felt that I really need to revise my opinion. So this here is, this little blip when you see CPI and core slowing down. So the inflation starts taking off in February 21. That is sort of, dashed line is put there for a reason, because if you remember, this is the month before Biden, put in his, what was it, 1.6 trillion stimulus, and that was passed just when the month after, and you see right away that the inflation takes off. Many people feel that is just a striking coincidence, and this is all just commodity prices. But commodity prices are endogenous, and I'm going to show you some reasons for why I think commodity prices were not really. I mean, they played a role, but actually, and we'll see some role, but really just because of the interaction with the nonlinear Phillips curve. And then you see the second dashed line. That's when the Fed finally started raising rates. And, there are many people that claim that raising rate doesn't do anything, but then they're confronted also with this miracle that as soon as the Fed started raising rates, we start seeing a decline. You see here, the blip here, this is really the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sometimes people talk about the surge as being due to that, but I mean, that really happens, at its peak. Okay, so let me get to where I'm going with this. So first of all, let me just say that I was not the only surprised party, only surprised person during this time, because, okay, so here you see two pictures. And one of the first thing you may think when you see this picture, well, isn't this just the same picture? Well, no, it isn't. It shows you actual inflation in red, and then the Federal Reserve Summary of Economic Projections at each time with these dashed lines, okay? But then survey of professional forecasters. And what you see is that, they were constantly predicting it would go back to target. But then as inflation is surging, there was this consistent belief that it was just about to drop down to target. And they were wrong until the Fed started raising rates. Okay, so I mean, I guess when I look at this in retrospect, and that's of course a little bit unfair towards the Fed, but I did study in a paper with Don Cohn. I do think there is a little bit of a recognition lag here after basically right after my article, because then you start seeing really broad-based increase in inflation, and it took them from say October to March to really start moving for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into now, but I have this paper with Don Cohn that goes into that. There was several moving parts there. Okay, so yeah, we were not the only. I was not the only one wrong, but when like Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. So I have changed my mind, and the way I have changed my mind is that I think behind the scene here is a nonlinear Phillips curve, and and that's why I had it's back in the title of the paper, because actually, as it turns out, the curve we're going to suggest is going to be pretty much close to what Phillips original Phillips curve was from 1958, and I'm like everybody else. We don't really read much old papers, but I did read his, and I was struck by, and I'm going to show you some. I was struck by that was in fact his main point, that it was nonlinear. It just somehow got lost. But so that's one aspect. But the second aspect is that we're going to argue that this nonlinearity kicks in due to what we call labor shortage, and that's when V, which is the number of vacancies firm post, so the number of workers firms are looking for, relative to unemployment, is above some threshold. And we're going to derive that threshold endogenously. But sort of in the history of labor economics, Beveridge, sort of the founding father of labor economics, he put this threshold at 1. And it actually turns out that statistically that works remarkably well. So the structure of this talk is that first I'm going to provide evidence. I'm going to do some more sort of motivation here. Then I'm going to provide a theory. And sometimes so just if I can ask the organizer, I guess in case they can speak back to me, I think I have an hour, so I guess I have now about 50 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, we were thinking of 40, 45, 50, and then some questions, but there's flexibility as much.
So I have about half an hour left, I guess, or so.
Maybe like a little bit more than that.
Yeah, okay, great. Just want to make sure that oftentimes I don't get to the theory, which is a bit of a pity, but I'm on applied theories, but I guess I got so excited when I finally ran a regression that I can't stop talking about it. Okay, so we're going to explain the inflation is due to a labor shortage, and this labor shortage, V over U being greater than some critical value that you can roughly think of as 1, because that's what the data seem to suggest, that's when nonlinearities of the Phillips curve kick in. So that's going to trigger inflation. But there's a second element that I think is very important here. And I was saying supply shocks are endogenous and all. For whatever reason, I think the literature has largely gone into wanting to explain this with primarily supply shocks. And I'm not quite sure why that is, because I'll show you why I'm not completely convinced of that, except in my framework, actually, or our framework, they are going to play a big role, but it is because they play a bigger role than normally because you are at the nonlinear part of the Phillips curve, because V over U is greater than 1. Under normal circumstances, we find that supply shocks do not do a whole lot to core inflation, just non-core, where we have stripped out energy prices and food and such. So one of the key policy implications when we released this paper, which was 2002, I think, which shows just how incompetent I am in submitting papers, we had prominently as a policy prediction a soft landing. Now I guess we can almost say that that has become a confirmation of the model. Although there's a wrinkle to that that I'm going to tell you in a minute, which is that even if we have seen something like a soft landing, V over U is still above 1, which suggests that that soft landing we have seen just now may turn bumpy pretty quickly if there's a surge in commodity prices. Okay, so this is actually the original Phillips curve. Okay, this is, he had the rate of change of wages, and this is for a particular subsample here. And, if you just read the first paragraph of his paper, I usually don't go much. We get paid for, like Lucas said, we get paid for writing, not reading. I try to not live up to that, but try to read a little bit. But this, just in his first paragraph, even if you just read the first paragraph of his paper, one of his main points actually is the fact that the Phillips curve is nonlinear. And his argument was very straightforward. It was just that, and he has wages here, unemployment. He was saying that, people are going to be very reluctant to accept any wage cuts, but they're more than happy to accept the wage increases. So at this level here, at low unemployment, he argued firms started outbidding each other for workers and wages started rising fast. But at the high level of unemployment, you don't see the same mechanism because workers will not accept wages below the prevailing wages. And I'm going to be precise what I mean by prevailing wages when I get to theory. And it's sort of interesting to me that this sort of original Phillips curve is actually quite similar, if you think about it, to the crude Keynesian AS curve that predated Phillips. And this, I had the blessing of going to the University of Iceland, where the textbooks were, well, somewhat dated. So I actually learned all about crude Keynesianism. And I remember this graph from the University of Iceland, okay, when there's unemployment, increasing demand, there's no change in prices, but then you just hit a wall and no more increase in output because you have employed all factors of production, and it's only going to show up in inflation. And if you plot up the original Phillips curve that Phillips estimated, it actually looked remarkably similar to the sort of crude Keynesian. So what happened? So how did we forget this? There's something intuitive about the crude Keynesian Phillips curve. I mean, if you just think about it, you increase demand, you are going to hit some capacity constraint. Most obviously, there's only so many people you can hire. At some point, just run out of people. And what can you do then? Well, you can raise prices or ration. In wartime, we often see rationing because the government imposes some controls. So what happened? Why did this suddenly disappear from our knowledge lexicon? Although, to be clear, I mean, many of us did have some of these. In my work on secular stagnation, we actually did have a nonlinear Phillips curve, and that was also sort of how this paper came about. But the reason we had a non-linear Phillips curve was that we were analyzing a steady state, and we didn't want to have a long-run trade-off, so that's why I took this form. But that was sort of for a different application. Okay, so how did it disappear? Where did it go? I think it happened. I think the history of economic thought is kind of clear here. It's just when Phillips come to America, what made the Phillips curve really famous was Solow and Samuelson paper in 1960, and this is a picture from their paper. And of course, they mention some about nonlinearities, but if you look at this picture, that's not really the main point they're making here. They're making a point there's a menu of choices between unemployment and average price inflation. Now, of course, there's also some caveats and footnotes and things like that, where they talk about some about expectations, some about nonlinearity, and so on. But the general profession took out of this that there was some stable relationship where you could pick B, which is here 4% inflation, but if you want to bring and 3% unemployment, but if you want to bring down inflation to zero, then unemployment would rise to 5.5. And we all sort of know what happened, right? Where the literature went and why then the nonlinearity fell into the background, which is, you just see it in this picture. Look here at the bottom. I mean, the Phillips curve traced out after Solow Samuels from 61 to 69, that sort of looks to trace out some sort of Phillips curve. But then, of course, and this was, I guess, somewhat prophetically predicted by both Milton Friedman and Phelps, that didn't take into account expectations. And even if Solow and Samuelson made a passing reference to them, that was not the main thrust of the paper. And they predicted, Phelps and Friedman, as soon as you would try to exploit this Phillips curve, which, you could argue the Fed and the government was trying to do in the 60s, it would break down. And expectation would start moving, which is exactly what you see here. That's the most conventional interpretation of this picture, that the Phillips curve shifted due to expectations. So which brings us then to the new Keynesian consensus of how to think about the last great inflation. And I think that consensus very much colored how I was thinking about inflation in 21 and a lot of other people. Okay, so what was that consensus? Well, this was the old Phillips curve, right? And then the new Phillips curve, new Keynesian Phillips curve, which incorporated this insight of Phelps and Friedman, but just has more dynamics in it because it had forward-looking expectation. And then the consensus was, well, what happened in the 70s? Well, there were big supply shocks that made inflation expectation unanchored. So that's why we start seeing this thing moving all around. Okay, but then the second thing was emerging from this consensus was that kappa here, namely, if you run output above potential, it's going to have very, very little effect on inflation. So example from Hazel, Herano, Steinson, and Nakamura from QG 2022, unemployment goes up by 1%, inflation goes down only by 0.34%, or take it the other way, if unemployment goes down by 1%, very limited effect on inflation. And they based this importantly, and what I'm going to say is not inconsistent with their result, because the window of observation they were exploring was 1978 to 2018. And that was a period where there was no, the labor market never reached like V over U above 1. And so this thing here, this small slope was also one of the key motivation for the Fed's new framework announced in 2002, which put much more emphasis on employment reaching its maximum level. And one of the argument was that, well, because kappa is so low, there is very little harm in allowing for a bit overshooting on that score, while the cost of having people unemployed is very high. Okay. So the conventional wisdom then was, when people always fighting the last war, that expectation, this is from the Livingstone survey, this is actual inflation, and this year's inflation expectation, 12-month Livingstone survey expectation, which have the advantage of going very far back. It's just 1 year ahead. So that was, so in 2001, what I was looking at, and I think everybody else, we were looking at inflation expectation. And they just hadn't moved a lot, especially when you looked at things like five-year forwards, longer term. It seemed like they were very well anchored. There were some temporary movements, but we had seen those in the past, like in 2008, actually, if you remember, when we were expecting deflation, there was a short period where inflation went up largely due to commodity prices. Inflation expectation are anchored. Kappa is very small, so what is there to worry about? Well, let's then move outside of this observational window that Nakamura and Steinson and much of the literature uses, and ask ourselves, for the U.S., what have the four major inflation surges have in common if we don't just focus on the last war against inflation? Well, here is an interesting picture, I think. This here is labor market tightness measured by number of vacancy firms post relative to the number of workers the firms are trying to fill, number of jobs they're trying to fill, relative to the number of people looking for jobs. Okay? And if you look at it, so this was below 1 in the great inflation of the 70s, so that's why nobody was really looking at this. But if you look at the inflation surges for other ones, it's basically the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War II, and World War I. And what do all of these periods have in common? Well, they have this labor market tightness measure being above 1. This happened during the ramp up of the Vietnam War. This happened even most spectacularly during World War II, and actually the tightness of the labor market has never been as tight as it was in 2022 since World War II. And then in World War I as well, we don't have the tightness measure going further than 1919. There are here two other small episodes where there seem to have, but I really don't know. We haven't studied those. And one thing I learned of this, one thing I learned in the process of writing this paper, which was somewhat of a uncomfortable realization, which is that it actually looks like price control actually work, at least for the official prices. There's always then a black market, but you can really just see it during the war times, and during the war times, and also actually Nixon imposed price controls and then lifted them. Okay, so that's sort of the bottom line here. Inflation, aside from the 1970s, when inflation expectation became anchored, are really characterized by labor tightness, and that's sort of where this, like I mentioned this before, it sort of immediately brought to me the old strange Keynesian fairy tale that was a conventional wisdom a long time ago, and I learned at the University of Iceland in 1990s, being blessed with old textbooks. And the conventional wisdom was just if you increase normal spending, output up, and inflation a little bit to start with, but there's only so far you can go. Firms can increase output, but at the end of the day, there was always be one major limiting factor. This is the whole population of Iceland, and if you have hired everybody but this one person, well, after you hire that one person, you're gonna hit some sort of nonlinearity, and this is actually from my old textbook. So, and I find it very hard to argue with this logic. I mean, at some level, from a theoretical point of view, it has to have some validity to it. So the key idea here is then that we have been in the region below 5-star since early 2070s, because the Fed has essentially always preempted any signs of inflation when they saw the labor market get hot. This strategy changed with the new framework that they released. I want to say, I think I screwed up the numbers before. They released it in August 2020, where they said that they would wait for, and then they had forward guidance in 2021, September, 2020, September, saying they would not raise rates until both inflation and unemployment were above target. Okay, so once you have this, once you're on the steep side, then demand shock starts having a lot bigger impact, but also supply shocks that start shifting this. They have a much bigger effect at the steep part of the supply curve. And intuitively, you can think about it, not the only way to think about it, but if prices of inputs go up and the labor market is tight, you cannot substitute across the two. It's not the only way to think about it, but that's one way. Okay, so now why is V over U seem to be a better predictor than unemployment alone? And so I'm not so sure this is true outside of the US, because a lot of the countries during the pandemic trying to maintain employment relationship between firms and workers, most notably Germany. But it certainly was the case in the US. And one of the things you see here, the Fed was very much staring at unemployment and saying, like in March 22, well, the labor market is still slack and unemployment is at 6%. But when you look at V over U, and they looked at labor force participation, and that was also far from where it was. This is primate labor force participation that Jay Powell used a lot. So the labor market still seems slack, and they had committed to keeping the rate at 0 until labor market had recovered. And they only really raised the rates once unemployment had gone to almost back to pre-COVID level, and so had labor force participation. Yet at the same time, and there were some people at the Fed pointing at this, including Dallas Fed, where Mark Giannone, my old friend, was the head of the research department, and is a bit of a hero in this story because he recognized way before me, actually half a year before me, to be exact, that V over U, the labor market was screaming murder. That it was really becoming very tight. V over U was one measure, but also, and V over U, if you have a stable beverage curve, you can map one to the other. But the beverage curve became very unstable during this time because of the amount of separations and so on. Okay, I am going over too slowly. So, okay, let me, the rest of the talk, empirical results, and then I hope I'll be able to talk a little bit about model. So for an applied theorist like me, there are two types of empirical evidence that I find especially compelling. First, anecdotal evidence. Second, scatter plots. Okay, so once I'm convinced by anecdotal evidence and scatter plots, then I'm willing to start running regression. So that's going to be how I proceed here. This is like, if you were living in the United States during this period, it was just impossible not to know. First of all, I'd never even heard the term labor shortage. But, I went into a restaurant with my family of 6, pizza restaurant close to my house. We asked for a table. The restaurant is full 1/3. The rest is just empty. And the waitress says to me, "No, I'm sorry, we are full." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about? 2/3 of the restaurant is empty. What's wrong with these tables?" "Oh, labor shortage," he said. And that was, it was very hard to hire. I mean, just getting people to do work in your garden or whatever. And this is and this was not just Rhode Island where I live. Look at Pennsylvania, McDonald's started, first time in its history, to offer $500 sign-in bonus. Even more disturbingly, McDonald's in Baltimore, instead of signing bonus, offered their employee that they could eat as much McDonald's as they wanted, which strikes me as pretty gruesome. But it was very in these low end, because that's where wage gain, that's where the tightness was the biggest. People were quite desperate in finding people. And this extended beyond just the immediacy of the COVID epidemic, when people understandably didn't want people to be breathing in their face. And here is, higher June 21, closed due to no staff. This is Virginia, and we saw this a lot in the US. I saw this in that stores just started closing on certain days. The pharmacy started closing between 12 and 2. And here is a store in Virginia that in 22 that says that, they're closed on Mondays and Tuesday due to continued staff shortages and hiring challenges. And the way you see this in the data is that, this here shows you so this is from, let me cite the authors of this, Crump, Giuseppe, Giannone, and Sahen. The wages leading up to 2019, before this tightness starts showing up, there was some wage gains in the lower end, but it was pretty flat here. But then, as we enter this inflationary period, the inflation surge, we see a massive increase between 20-25% increase at the lower end of the spectrum, right? That's indicative of the hiring bonus of McDonald's and these sort of stores, service stores. But this was true across the board and the lower end of the skill distribution. So that's why inequality has actually been decreasing in the U.S. post-COVID. So let's move on. Yeah, so I said anecdotal evidence. That's my first line of, and then this is interesting. Now, of course, I understand that scatter plot is just a scatter plot. It's an intersection of demand and supply and so on. And nevertheless, I think it is rather striking if you just take, people make fun of the Phillips curve cloud, and they're usually referring to this cloud or this cloud, where it's hard to see much of a slope. But let's just take a look at the periods where there's labor market tightness. And you can see here that this is in logs. As soon as you reach this threshold of 1, so log of 1 is 0, you see a remarkable increase in steepness. And this is, something that you would want your model to replicate, because this is just raw data. And then of course you want to take into account all sorts of challenges in the estimation and dodging. But I think it's just pretty informative just to see these here 4 pictures and how striking it is, this pattern. So our first objective in this paper by Pierpaolo and I, which are not exactly the most have not exactly made our career in empirical economics. So what we want to do was to run the most uncreative regression for Phillips curve that we could find, that had been run like thousands of times before. And here I'm just going to report from our from 2008 onwards. I'll show you a table that has more. But so what we have here, the only thing we have added to these, there's been these thousands of regression people have run. We're just going to add a dummy variable, both for the labor tightness and for the supply shock. Okay, that's the only thing we're going to do. We're only going to have a dummy variable there. Okay, that's it. And then our question is going to be, well, is this significant or not? So this dummy variable takes in value 1 when, log of theta is above 0, so when there's labor market tightness. And what we find is that, the slope of the Phillips curve is very low under normal circumstances, consistent with, the Nakamura and Steinson evidence. But then you see this massive steepening, which is just like what you saw on the scatter plots. And similarly here, effective supply shock is essentially 0 under normal circumstances. And notice this is core inflation. But when you interact it with the dummy, you get a significant effect. So I think this is quite suggestive of, and there have been a lot of discussion about whether these regression are identified. There's a good paper by in the NBR macro annual, for example, by Terriana and I'm blanking on the name. Another good English economist. So there have been discussion about problems of identification, but what they point out in the macro annual is if you have a good proxy for supply shocks, you do indeed get identification. So to the extent that we have a good proxy for it, which I'll talk to in a minute, then it is identified. So this here just shows you the whole sample, and again, it's just highlighting this main point that I just already showed you. But we split it in subsample, full sample, and so on. And I want to talk about a little bit about supply shocks. And so so as I said, we want just to follow what the literature had done. And actually, we wanted to follow what the literature has done prior to the inflation surge, because I feel like a lot of the literature since, has been finding all sorts of number of ship containers delayed in LA, there are all sorts of series, and they all sort of miraculously seem to track exactly the inflation, ergo it's the supply thing. But what people were looking at as measure of supply shock before, as opposed to ex post, was what Ball calls CPI headline shock, which is basically the difference between CPI and core, or PCE, the personal consumption index headline shock, or the import price relative to GDP deflator. And what you can see here, according to this metric, well, first was and then we just, these were the three most common measures we saw. We just took the first principle component. I mean, we ran them with all of these individually. It didn't make matter. We thought, why not just try to extract from all of them? And what immediately popped out to you is how big the shock were in the 70s, and in comparison, how low they are now, right? And in fact, that they have reversed themselves. They're much lower than, for example, during 2008, around there, or just, over this period. There's nothing, according to this traditional measure of supply shock that is saying, oh my God, this is the first natural place to look. Except, though, that what our regression was saying is that so all of these here hatched line are lines that when you interact, theta being above 1 or above what we estimate to be the cutoff point, which actually turned out to be surprisingly close to 1, these interaction terms play a big role. So labor tightness, the low kappa, that is not explaining a lot, right? You have to really have the nonlinearity to get anywhere. So this is just a decomposition of the regression, by the way. So there's, it's delicate to talk about causal, but it just shows you through what mechanism inflation is traveling according to that regression. But you see here that the commodity shocks also do play a role, because when interacted with the labor market being tight. And I wanted to just point out to you somewhat distressing thing about the fact that, yes, inflation has been going down according to some measure, especially here, and now I think there's some new readings that are promising. But according to the regression, this is mostly coming from favorable negative commodity shocks. The labor market is still very tight, and that would mean that inflationary commodity shock, think Israel invading Lebanon, more problems in the Middle East, and oil prices will start to shoot up. So this tells you the same regression. I just like showing it because it sort of is a proof of concept, because the same regression shows that, yes, it was expectation that did it during the 70s, according to this regression, which is consistent with our narrative. And interestingly enough, in the 70s, that's when inflation, in the late 60s, you saw there was labor tightness, and you start seeing a increased inflation, that inflation expectations started to become unanchored. But they're really not doing a whole lot as of late. Okay, so this is complementary. This is from my student, Julia Giddy. And this is nice because this shows you 2011 to 2003 MSA level data. And there were some, because there's some MSA level areas that were tight, even if some of the other ones were not. And you can see sort of the same pattern here in the cross section, the US. And not all of these things here coincide with post-2008. So I think this is pretty compelling evidence. This here is from a little paper at the AEA that Pier Paolo and I wrote for the Papers and Proceedings. It's the kind of paper you couldn't get away with publishing without it being in the Papers and Proceedings, because it's just a bunch of scatter plots. And here we use unemployment because the V over U, I don't think we didn't have access to good V over U data. We're looking at it now, and I'm also not even sure that it is as informative. But you can kind of see somewhat similar patterns here. And then for fun, we actually fitted Phillips' actual curve to this data, and that's the black line here. And you see it looks very much like the sort of piecewise linear thing that we estimated. Okay, model, and I have approximately 5 minutes, I think, now. Is that right? Do I have 5 minutes? I'm going to assume that is a yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
so
Yep.
the bottom line is that I'm going to just browse through a model that gives you this: labor market tightness, inflation. Then going from, to where inflation was before, up to, full market tightness, increases inflation only from, 2 to 2.4. But then when you move from 1 to 2, you get 5.8. And this is the model, this is the bottom line of the model we derive. And we have then tied these coefficients to our estimates, which one can do. And this here is the supply shock. Okay, so what is the model? We model here labor participation. Okay, so people are choosing the number of people that participate in the job market. We use a trick from Gali, although he used it for total hours. We use it for labor force participation. And this is the kind of integration even I can do. This FW is just something that it becomes more expensive to have your grandmother go on the job market or your teenage son than the primates adult in the household. And there's a fixed number of hours each worker has. Now, the labor force is separated into employed and unemployed. And this is unemployed at the end of period T. This is the number of job vacancy posted, and this is the labor market tightness, okay? And then there's and this is just the vacancy rate and the unemployment rate. And here's a devious little trick we have, which I'm quite happy with. I'm sure the labor search matching people will probably complain loudly, but having n as a state variable doesn't really do a whole lot because the convergence is so quick in these models. So why not then just get rid of the state variable by having, namely NT from last period, and at the beginning of each period, the household decide labor force participation. 1 minus S is those that are attached to existing firms, which is, similar to the notion that those that just, kept their previous job. But, we choose them at random, so we don't need to keep track of NT minus 1. And then S times F are the people searching for a job. And this sort of nests the standard deviation model and one in which everybody searches every period. And the important distinction here that we make is between existing workers, that's these guys that get paid WTX, and those that take new jobs, okay? And those who take new jobs include those that were entering from unemployment in the previous period, but also people that were employed in previous period and are doing job-to-job switch. And in fact, most of the new jobs creation is actually not people going from unemployment to employment, but going from employment to employment. So they are getting new wages, and that's important because those new wages can, in principle, be different from the existing wages when the labor market is hot. That's one of our key assumptions. So what is this new? People enter the labor force to get a job to job switches, like I said, that's about 70% of matches, and people that go from unemployment to employment. So we just have a standard and matching function, okay? So let me, for the lack of time, and this is just first order condition for labor force participation. And then we have an oil here, we have an intermediate input because we want to have cost push shock. And the only difference, we have Rodenberg prices here just because we were too lazy to do the Calvo prices. My former advisor, Mike Woodford, would probably be angry. And the key difference between this and what you have seen is that what enters the marginal cost is actually new wages, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you want to increase production, you need to hire new workers. So it shouldn't be the guys that have been working there for 30 years with stagnant wages that matter. No, it's the new guys. And that's very important because in the standard New Keynesian model, this here just becomes approximated because it has all workers get approximated by labor share, leading people like Bernanke and Blanchard thinking that there was no role of the labor market because they were using measures of all wages. And, when you have inflation, the real wages of a bunch of workers go down. So, the labor share was shrinking. But that's not the relevant thing. The relevant thing is, according to our theory, is what I showed you before here, that, not the anecdote, but here, the new wages were skyrocketing. So for firms to expand production became very expensive. Their marginal cost was a lot higher here than here. And it wouldn't be appropriate to look at the labor share as a measure of that, of marginal cost. I mean, that's a good measure of total labor cost, but not the cost of increasing production, which is what matters in the pricing decisions of the firms. So that's sort of the bottom line then. Then we have, I'm not going to go, so we're going to then model the wage setting as people will not accept wages below existing wages, but they're happy to accept wages that are above. So this is capturing Philip's idea. And then we model the way in which these are determined by a simple hiring agency problem that I'm going to scale. Where you would expect employees to bid up wages quite quickly. So that's this thing here. So I'm going to just skip it because I'm out of time. Instead, just showing you the bottom line, which is then this kind of Phillips curve that has this slope, and it's a lot is coming from the new wages. And let me just end by showing you a couple of pictures. This is from the model. So this would be the run-up inflation. There's a shift in aggregate supply back, both due to reduction in labor supply due to the epidemic, but also a massive increase due to the ARA stimulus, which you see here. I mean, this is one of the most spectacular increase in real disposable income in U.S. economic history. This reaches back to 1960. This is Trump. This is Biden. So, I mean, that looks awfully suspicious to me as a demand shock. In contrast, the 70s was an example where you were on the flat part and inflation expectation was shifting up, and it became then very costly to bring down inflation because it was very flat, and was mainly because you were trying to convince people inflation expectation was going down. Finally, the model can also explain why there was not more deflation during I mean, that's consistent with our estimates. This is a little bit about the beverage curve and how it was behaving, and that was very much consistent with our model, this sort of soft landing. But, the original shift was due to separation, but I don't have time for that. So implications, easy up, easy down, provided the Fed doesn't over-tightening. A key prediction was a soft landing, and that looks reasonable now, except for that the labor market is still tight. For some reason, people interpret our paper as saying the Fed shouldn't tighten, which, no, it doesn't say that. Tightening and falling inflation doesn't need to lead sharp reduction in output or increase or sharp reduction in output, just a fall in vacancies. So I provided you a new framework to understand inflation spike, replacing the New Keynesian Phillips curve with what we call the inverse L New Keynesian Phillips curve involving this measure of slack. I provide suggested evidence and some policy implication. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over time.
Thank you, guys. I think we'll take. I think there's a bit of feedback from your speaker. I think we'll take a couple of questions. We've got a couple of microphones that hopefully will be connected such that you can hear the questions. So are there any questions for Gauti? I've got one here down at the front. I guess while somebody's moving to get the microphone, Gauti, you touched on policy right at the end. I was wondering if, is there a sort of simple implication of like a piecewise Taylor rule, conditional on your vacancies rates. And also, I wonder if this has implications for the. I mean, you started by mentioning the Fed's policy framework review in 2020. You know, what are your feelings about that? Maybe with reference to this model.
Well, I mean, I think for those. So I was not as familiar with it just 1.5 years ago as I am now, because I wrote a paper about it. But one of the most radical aspects of it was this asymmetric nature of the objective, which basically just said inflation on target, and they would only penalize shortfall of employment from its maximum level. So there's an asymmetry there, meaning that they're fine with employment going above what they consider as sustainable. And that was a major shift, because before that, if you look at what the Fed was doing, recognizing lags, they were always trying to preempt inflation. So I think the period of 1970, late 70s up till this inflation surge is really marked by whenever the labor market got hot, the Fed put on the brakes, and that behavior changed. And we see the results of that, because they wanted to see they want to eliminate what they thought of as the employment shortfall. And there were two problems with it. First, I think their estimate of the shortfall was wrong, because we're not thinking about metrics like VOU, but just sort of unemployment and labor force participation. So that was an obvious problem. But the second is also that I think it naturally leads to some inflationary bias, and I think we saw that play out. So I think there is reason to rethink the framework a bit, although it may happen just organically because people now recognize, I think, at the Fed better this danger. I think it was just a lack of, like for me as well, lack of appreciation that you could get this quick acceleration in a very tight labor market. So we haven't studied optimal policy here yet, or tried to put together some policy rules that would approximate the optimal policy, but that would obviously be a next step.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. Gulçin, there's another question.
Thank you. Gulçin Özkan, King's College. So the key in your framework is this vacancies over unemployment, and there's a threshold. If you are above the threshold, it does have a direct impact and an indirect impact working through the supply shocks. So if we look at this period, one of the key things happening was the disruption in supply networks, right? So if I think of that as a negative supply shock, what should be the mechanism I should be thinking about, how this theta impacting on these supply shocks? Is it the following? For example, if we didn't have the shortages and we had supply chain disruptions, normally we would have had some substitution, but because we are beyond this theta star, we don't get that. Is this the kind of mechanism I should be thinking about, or there's something else?
Yeah, that is what is going on in the model. That now you don't have the ability to substitute out from these intermediate inputs into and using labor to compensate. That's the key mechanism we have there. So yeah, I don't want to say that supply disruption didn't have a big role, except just to point out that these metrics that we had of supply disruption prior to this surge, people have constructed a variety of new ones now. But if you just use those wouldn't have done a whole lot. You need something more, and I think this model offers a pretty plausible mechanism through which they could have had an outsized effect in this time around. And it's through the type of substitution.
Excellent. Can I check if there are any more questions? Yeah, one more. Maybe. Yeah.
Hi, Oscar Sons from European Central Bank. So I find your story super convincing. It was very US based. I was wondering if any thoughts on how it translates to maybe the UK, the Euro area, or even some country like Japan, which has a bit of a different experience.
Yeah, so we are. I showed you this picture from the. I showed you this picture with. We did this little. We did sort of just a quick and dirty attempt to look at other countries, and that was this figure I showed you here. We called it slanted L curve, and there we were only looking at the unemployment rate and inflation. And, you know, you do see it sort of looks to line up. The thing we have here, though, which is different from in our paper focusing on the US, is that we have the unemployment rate. We are now looking to get vacancy rates. I suspect, though, that V over U is not going to be as informative in some of these countries as it is for the US, partially because you know, a lot of the response to the pandemic in the U.S. was, you know, to let people just fire people and then send some, you know, stimulus checks to everybody. While in Germany, I understand, and this is also part in my home country, Iceland, they emphasized instead maintaining existing employment relationship in some form. So, you know, once the recovery then started, I think there was less, you probably, and this is just a conjecture, we don't have the data yet, I suspect you see less extreme movements in vacancies because they were able to recall existing workers. But then employment should still seems to capture this relatively well. But as I said, I mean, we're just starting to try to understand how this generalizes. But yeah, my main concern there is the different institutional arrangement and the different response of the governments to the crisis and the way in which they intervened in the labor markets that could show up in different ways. It could also be like, for example, that the cutoff of V over U is different across countries, partially because of labor institutions. You know, when you have union bargaining and so on.
I think there's one more question. Oh, no, we're good. Cody, thank you ever so much. Best wishes back in Rhode Island. And that's tremendous.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. I'm not sure how to silence you now, but I'll try to. Well, feel free to log off.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thank you.
Cheers. Okay. Excellent day. Thanks for everybody who's participated.